So Amelia, can you tell us about what a dead zone is?
Sure. So sometimes in cities, especially after the zombie apocalypse, you get a lot of people and they just kind of pile the dead and then the zombies go around and eat the living and they contribute to that.
Wait, did you know? That's pretty funny that she actually knew the end. So last week, a conflict of interest in world news was the dead zone. How do you feel about the topic at hand?
Well, about the dead zone, isn't that in Tampa Bay, Florida, where there's pollution in the water and so all the fish turn up dead?
Yeah, how do you know? Shane, could you possibly tell us about what you think a dead zone is?
So a dead zone is an area where it's like a lot of people die and then you put them into that area because it's a zone. Because there's a lot of dead people there, it's a dead zone.
So Dr. Curtis, would you have by any chance know what a dead zone is?
Let me think about that. Sports, classes, environmentalism, I think. Ecology, maybe. Just off the top of my head.
Perhaps. So is there any way you can explain to us what
Let me
what
think
happens?
a little bit more to my experiences in the Gulf of Mexico, I think. Hasn't it got something to do with fertilizer runoff from fields running into the Gulf? That creates, just pulling this out of my mind, algae blooms. And of course we know that fish love algae blooms and that then they create a waste. And then doesn't bacteria feed off of that waste? And the problem is that bacteria uses oxygen from the system and doesn't give it back. Dead zone.
But I'm still confused on what a dead zone really is. Well, we know we need air to breathe. This air isn't only produced by trees and plants, which is a common myth. A huge amount of it is created by these tiny microorganisms called phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are generally good. They produce oxygen for us and they act as a base for the food chain. But sometimes they overpopulate and start to take over the places they inhabit. When this happens, an algae bloom occurs. This isn't so great. Algae blooms with millions of tiny organisms start to take over huge portions of the ocean. They provide tiny fish and other organisms with a never-ending 5-course meal. But the old adage holds true here too. What goes in must come out. All of that food is turned into waste, and all of that waste causes a bacteria explosion in the water and on the ocean floor. This bacteria starts to grow in huge amounts, eating the waste of the fish. The problem? The bacteria need oxygen to survive, so they start sucking up all of the oxygen out of the water. Because there are so many bacteria as a result of the huge amount of waste, they almost completely deplete the water of any oxygen, causing the conditions to become hypoxic. And the worst part? It's hard for the water to be reoxygenated because of the different densities of the fresh and the salt water. So, now we have a ton of water that doesn't have oxygen and isn't able to get oxygen very fast. As stated earlier, we call these conditions hypoxic. When the water gets hypoxic, fish, shrimp, and ocean floor dwelling creatures are unable to get enough oxygen through the water. They start to die and large amounts of dead fish and other animal debris float to the surface. Hence the name dead zone.
But we still haven't talked about what causes these dead zones. Most believe farms using fertilizers are the ones to blame. When crops like corn don't soak up all the fertilizer, it ends up flowing down large water plains and into rivers. This is a picture of the US, and this is the Mississippi as well as Missouri rivers. This is the area that runs off into the river. That's 40% of the US. This means that even this crop grown all the way up in South Dakota may have an effect on the dead zone thousands of miles away. So you have a huge amount of dense fertilizer that builds up. And what does this do when it reaches the ocean? Well, it causes algae blooms, waste, bacteria, a lack of oxygen, and a dead zone. Currently, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico resets itself each year. However, the hypoxic conditions will eventually get to the point where they can't reset. This affects us because in these hypoxic conditions, some fish's reproductive systems begin to shrink over time. Therefore, they can't reproduce. The weaker fish, the fish we eat, can't swim out of the dead zones. This means eventually the lack of fish will be monumental, and the fishing industry in the Gulf of Mexico could be permanently affected.
The Science Center Pond, the one dead zone to rule them all. There isn't much difference between the Science Center Pond and the dead zone in the Gulf. The biggest differences are the size and the fact that the pond here is freshwater. Really, these differences mean little in the grand scheme of understanding the system. Over the past year, the production of the new math building, right over there, really put things into motion in the pond. In addition to the urban runoff that comes from the Wallingford watershed, the construction also contributed to the flow of nutrients in the water. You can't see it now because hell has frozen over here in Wallingford, Connecticut, but the effects of the construction and watershed can be seen especially in the spring and summer. When you see giant algae blooms covering the pond, this is a product of the runoffs. Thankfully, the pond is constantly in motion. However, the algae blooms do indicate the onset of a dead zone, and eventually, the formation of hypoxic conditions. How do we fix a problem and shrink its size? First is through legislation. Multiple groups such as the American Farm Bureau Federation and the National Association of Home Builders have lobbied state and federal legislatures against bills that would further exacerbate the problem. Such a law was passed 8 years ago when the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 was enacted by Congress to combat America's dependence on foreign oil. A main focus of the bill was ethanol production. The government asked for 15 million gallons of ethanol to be produced.
Ethanol is an alternative fuel source made from corn. At the time, more production seemed like a great idea, as the science pointed to ethanol as a green alternative to gas. But the bill actually made things worse. Farmers grew much more corn than they used to, which ramped up the use of nitrogen fertilizers. Algal blooms, which are the underlying cause of the dead zone, flourished as a result. Like chosuns swarming the dining hall at dinner time, the rapid spread of phytoplankton brought thousands of fish to the Mississippi River basin. To them, the influx of algal looked like an all-you-can-eat buffet. However, as previously mentioned, the cyanobacteria caused by the algal bloom decompose and prevent oxygen in the sea from being replenished. As you see here in these two graphs, the dead zone has actually increased in size since 2007, showing how a seemingly unrelated issue can have disastrous ecological effects.
Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that not very many people care about the dead zone. They're simply unconcerned about an ecological event occurring hundreds of miles away from their homes. Without support from the federal government and the public, groups like the Nature Conservancy have gone to court in support of their cause. In the 2013 court case, Gulf Restoration Network versus Jackson, a U.S. district court told the EPA that they have to make a necessity determination on the dead zone. But since the EPA is an agency under the executive office of the federal government rather than the judicial system, the court can't really assert their position. However, on their own initiative, the EPA has actually enacted plans to counter the dead zone in the past. In 2008, they suggested a 45% reduction in nitrogen levels as a result of the 2007 bill mentioned before. This was the EPA's 2008 action plan. Unfortunately, progress has been slow. The size of the dead zone has decreased somewhat since the action plan took effect, but it is still nowhere near the goal marked by the dotted line. A main issue is that the strategy relies a lot on the farmers themselves changing their ways, which only a few have accomplished. No consequence exists for those who don't comply, making implementation more difficult.
With the science becoming clearer, new suggestions to shrink the dead zone have appeared in the past year. In a new study conducted by the Journal of the American Water Resources Association in October 2014, scientists proposed that we rebuild drainage ditches, such as this one, and restore the wetlands around farms so less nitrogen deposits enter waterways. Essentially, this calls for a partial reconstruction of irrigation systems, especially around the Mississippi River. Since this study just came out recently, the action still has yet to take place. Sounds like a reoccurring theme here. However, some corporations are beginning to take the lead against the dead zone. Walmart, for example, has told its farmers to only use the amount of nitrogen fertilizer as advised by the Environmental Defense Fund. If more people follow Walmart's lead, the change will allow chemicals to dissolve into the ground rather than flow down streams, allowing the bayou to thrive with life once more.